Maybe it's all the social distancing. Maybe it's because I'm trying to find new and innovating ways to serve you CNFers. But I got something I'm desperate to announce. And the best part about it, it might not work. So what is it? Here it is. It's a call for submissions. CNF Pod is going to put out its first, and maybe only, audio magazine in a few months. And I'm putting the call out now for original work on this theme. You ready? Social distancing. Essays on or from isolation. Now, it can be coronavirus related, but I suspect the introverts among you know a thing or two about social distancing, certainly my fellow Gen Xers. These essays can be funny, sad, touching, voice-driven, scene-driven, journalistic, or memoiristic. But they have to be great, and they have to be read in 15 minutes or less. And they better be true. That's the deal. We're not talking super long essays here, maybe 2,000 words at most. So let's aim for that, 2,000 max. I will accept the submissions as Word or Google Doc attachments. Email them to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com with CNF Pod submission in the subject line. If I want to run your piece, I will reach out and we'll begin the editing process. You will have to figure out a great way to record your essay. There's tips I'll be happy to offer when the moment comes. Yes, you might be recording underneath a comforter. The submissions might get fancier down the road, but for now, email them as written work. But bear in mind, this is audio. Pay attention to the music of the language. I'll produce these essays with some music that sort of reflects the mood of the piece. Think how This American Life is structured. I'll be like Ira, announcing each one, teasing it out, and so forth. This audio mag is probably only going to have 3 to 4 essays, so hopefully I get at least 3 or 4 essays. Hopefully I get 20, 30, 40, 50. And so I hope so. This is a great chance for you to work in this and have published work. This is no joke. This is a new way to have your work published, so bring your A game. And given the theme, this is a way to express yourself and possibly work through some complicated feelings. We're all under a bit of stress with this, some more than others, but this could be a way to express yourself creatively and work through some things. As part of this, I'll be soon setting up a Patreon account. It's partly to support what I'm doing with CNF Pod on a weekly basis. You know the deal. But also, it's about finding a way to pay writers for work and also pay for the production that's going on with this audio mag. Hope you share this with people you think might be thrilled to submit their work. It's a challenge, and it's going to be fun. It's thrilling and exciting and scary, and that's the point. Why do anything else that doesn't push us into uncomfortable territory? I hope you're as excited as I am. Deadline, we're going to turn this around fairly quick in terms of deadline. Deadline is CNF Friday, May 1st. So you'll have to hustle. I'll be promoting this pretty hard to ensure I can get as many people submitting essays on this theme as possible. You know this show is a hub to talk shop with badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. You know we go deep here and we unpack things on a subcutaneous level, baby. This is yet another way for us to seek and destroy. Now get to work and show me what you got. And now, back to your regularly scheduled programming.
I kind of crave coworkers, although not right now because I don't want to get coronavirus, so I'm not going anywhere.
Creative Nonfiction Podcast, greatest podcast in the world, sponsored by Bay Path University's fully online MFA in Creative Nonfiction Writing. These faculty have a true passion and love for their work. Shines through with every comment, edit, and reading assignment. The instructors are available to answer the call, answer all your questions, and their years of experience as writers and teachers have made for an unbeatable experience. Head over to baypath.edu/MFA for more information. And as you know, this is CNF, Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey. Follow the show at CNF Pod on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and be sure you're subscribed on whatever podcast player you prefer. I'd love to hear from you, man, in either email, form, via tweet, DM, comment, your choice. Hey, oh yeah, by the way, Michael Schulman is here. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's written some of my favorite profiles of late on people like Adam Driver, Bo Burnham, and most recently, that's what made me reach out to him, he wrote about James Corden. The man can spin a yarn, this Michael Schulman. He's at MJ Schulman on Twitter, but we'll get to him shortly. So while you're washing your hands today, several times one hopes, for upwards of 20 seconds, one hopes, singing happy birthday 2 times, sing happy birthday to the podcast. This day, this CNF Friday, March 20th, is when this podcast launched 7 years ago. This day, exact day, I can't believe it. Though I hadn't heard of them at the time, I was only behind the long-form podcast by like 32 weeks. So we kind of started around the same time. They stuck with it while I floundered a bit until about the end of 2016 and really got rocking and rolling in 2017. In any case, this show has nearly published 200 interviews with the best of the best. 7 years. I can't tell you what it means to have made it this far, to get to make this show every week and make the friendships the show has allowed. I get to talk to you. I get to share this with you, make this for you. What a privilege, right? Person I was 7 years ago is unrecognizable to the person I am now, in large part because of this show and what it asked of me. So here's to 7 more years, right? Happy birthday, CNF Pod. If this show has meant anything to you, tweet some love at it, at CNF Pod, and maybe leave some cake, if you know what I mean, on Apple Podcasts. So, I tell you, it's been another week, CNFers. It has been another week. Never got the Tool last week, so understandably so, but no Tool show. This was the first full week of day job from home, and it's disorienting and certainly a bit unmooring. You know, just tooling around on social media. You can see people are going a bit crazy, a bit wacky. I get it. Though, I got to say, I'm thankful that I have a job where I can do this from home, because I know there are a lot of people out there struggling with this whole quarantine stuff. If you're struggling out there, if you're getting laid off or your hours are cut, I'm thinking about you. I really am. You know, lean on your community, lean on your CNFers. You know, if you need to, email me, email the show, ping me on Twitter. I'll put my arm around you and say we're going to get through this. Maybe even submit an essay on social distancing. You caught that at the top of the show, right? It's going to be a slog, this whole thing. But let's try and do our best work, because when things get back to normal, we're going to want to read and hear and see what you're capable of. I mean it, man. So Michael Schulman's here. He's the brilliant writer behind many of your favorite profiles. In this episode, we talk about his working at the New Yorker Festival for 9 years, which led to his break at the magazine, his background in theater, how he learned to interview for story and reportage versus live interviews, how his work is driven by joy, and how he likes to boil down his features and his profiles to one word. You're going to love this one, CNFers. So let's get after it. Stay safe, stay home, enjoy this show, all right? Coincidence what happened, I guess. You know, even before, you know, as it was kind of lining you up, I was listening to This American Life a couple weeks ago, and It's sure enough, it's just like it's the Everyone's a Critic episode, and then Ira starts talking about this writer named Michael who wrote this book on Meryl Streep, and he's on the intro in This American Life. How did that happen? How did that shake out?
Well, so I have a friend named Amanda Duarte who does a live show called Dead Darlings, which is writers talking about things they've had to cut or, things that never saw the light of day. And I was just telling her one night at a party about this method I had for, keeping myself sane with my Amazon critics, which was looking at clicking their names and looking at what products they liked, like a cupcake stand that came in polka dot or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And she invited me to do a version of that in her show. So I made a whole PowerPoint presentation and did it for an audience of 40 people in downtown Manhattan, half of whom were, homeless people who just came for the snacks because it was at a church. And then one person on the bill was my friend Elna Baker, who works at This American Life. So she invited me to do it at a live show that she does called Talent Show. And then they asked to record it for This American Life. And then so I performed it for, 100 drunk people in Brooklyn. And then they asked me to come into the studio and talk with Ira about it. So it started as really something very offhand and casual. And then suddenly it was, a very popular podcast. And I have to admit, I was very nervous about it because, talking about handling criticism and, Googling yourself, it's kind of embarrassing.
Right.
But I was happy with how it came out because, Ira is such a disarming interviewer and made it really comfortable for me.
That's amazing. And to what extent, I'm always curious about this, especially when Ira's talking to, say, like David Kestenbaum or even like some of his other reporters in that intro. So it might be a little different than your experience. But I wonder to what extent that interview is semi scripted, for lack of a better term. Or was it 100% organic? You didn't know what was coming and when you were, recording that intro?
Yeah, no, it was totally organic. I chatted with him a little bit as I came in about sort of what is this going to be sort of cutting back and forth with the live version that he taped, and he said it was, which, in the final version, he decided not to use the live recording of me doing it for an audience. But no, I didn't know what was coming, and there was one point where he turned the tables on me and said, have you ever looked at your 5-star reviews and seen what those people reviewed on Amazon? And and he had prepared examples for me, which were hilarious, but I had never thought of that, and I certainly didn't see that coming.
Yeah, that cracked me up when he's like, have you ever looked at this? You're like, oh no, and he's like, well, we did.
Yeah, no, it was a total setup because he made me go through some of the reviews that I had talked about on stage, and one of them was the person who gave me a 1-star review and then gave a 5-star review to a gift card on Amazon. And I just sort of riffed on that about how ridiculous that was to review an Amazon gift card on Amazon. And then that was a total setup because then he said, oh, here's someone who gave your book a great review, and they also reviewed an Amazon gift card. So it was a brilliant setup. It was so great. I thought it was really funny. So we talked for about 45 minutes, and
oh, wow.
He used 9 minutes of it. So it was 9 minutes in the end, and I don't know. I thought it was very well put together.
Now, this is always something I've wondered about in terms of editing audio and what it means to edit down to the best possible sound, but also like honoring the time that you were putting in. So you spent 45 minutes with him. He uses 20% of that. How does that make you feel in terms of, all right, I spent close to an hour, but they used 10 minutes. Like, how do you like that?
I was thrilled because they used a good 9 minutes.
Yeah.
I didn't want everything to be in there because I was sort of stumbling and trying to find my point and saying things that I was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. So, I was very happy with it. I mean, I'm used to it because I interview people all the time for, long pieces, and I don't use most of it.
Exactly.
I just use the best parts.
Exactly. It's weird. Like when as writers, as feature writers, when you think about the the 3 hours you might talk to a source and then you use like one quote, you don't kind of think about it when you're composing a story, but sometimes like the audio part, it almost feels a little more like, oh, you had to sat down, we were recording, the mics are on, that you want to use more of it, but really in service of that part of the story, and certainly in service of what you're writing, you need to use the juicy parts to make them, sound best, but also just to get the gold that you've been panning for the whole time.
A professor of mine in college said selection is as creative as generation.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Meaning that, and this was a theater directing class, but to choose the act of choosing is creative. It's, as important as coming up with something from nothing.
And what I like about at least how this thing came about, where you were on This American Life, is that at first you did, you're on this Dead Darlings show, and then you performed for 40 minutes for 40 people, and then another 100 people, and then of course someone in that audience happens to be this person, and there's something to be said about just putting yourself out there and like being out in the world creatively, and that's kind of how these experiences kind of generate themselves, because you had somewhat of a creative courage to kind of go out on that limb, and and look what happens as a result of that, right?
Yeah, I guess. Except I was a little freaked out by it too, because I hadn't planned on the whole world hearing this spiel I did for the drunk people in a church. So yeah, it was I don't know, came as a surprise to me.
Very nice. So, all right. So let's like back up a little bit and tell me where you grew up and kind of what your folks did and kind of what you were like as a kid.
So I grew up in Manhattan, actually, which people find very surprising, because there's a lot of people here in New York, but not a lot of people who are from here. But I was born and raised on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. My father's a lawyer. My mother is in early childhood education. I was a pretty shy kid until I was about 10, and then I went away to summer camp, and one of the counselors thought that I'd be good in the plays, so he cast me as the Scarecrow in Wizard of Oz, and that started my my coming out of my shell process. And I don't know, I was a bit sort of dreamy and spacey as a kid, and then became more extroverted.
Were you a bookish kid, always like into stories and stuff of that nature?
Yeah, but I also loved things like Broadway shows, which we would go to see all the time. I was obsessed with the Muppets, so I think I had a bit of like a wild, chaotic side that was waiting to come out.
At what point did you kind of get a validation as as a creator, as a writer, that this is something that you might be able to take up as you were, say, going through high school and into college?
Well, I really kind of backed into writing. As I said, I started acting in, camp plays and school plays when I was 10, and got really into that. I loved acting. I took a after-school theater class. And then in college, I started theater directing, and that was really my main activity. And I saw myself going into that, or possibly going into filmmaking. And it wasn't until I met this professor named Deb Margolin that I really got interested in writing. She has an interesting background. She's a performance artist who came up in the feminist downtown performance scene of the 80s in New York City. And her class was a lot about just getting people to write, even if they didn't think they were writers. If you were an actor taking the class, or a director or whatever, and not necessarily a playwright, she would just get people to write. We'd write in our journal, do automatic writing. We do these fill in the blanks as prompts. She just made it really easy. And other writing classes that I had taken in college, there was one that was I think it was a poetry writing class that I didn't end up taking, because the first day the guy just went around the table and asked people to name their favorite poet, and then just ridiculed everyone's answers. So there's kind of like this hazing element to a lot of creative writing classes, And Deb just didn't have any of that. She just wanted people to try it. And we all did our own, we created these solo performance pieces, which were really, like personal essays that were staged or character pieces. So that just made it seem like it was something that was accessible and got me interested in doing it. And then, it wasn't until I don't know. I mean, I nevertheless, I graduated, I moved back to New York, and I did have this plan to maybe be a theater director, maybe go to film school. I did a bunch of odd jobs in the city. Like I worked in a nursery school. I assistant directed a children's magic show off Broadway. At one point I was working for a guy who bought and sold Civil War memorabilia. So I was like taking photos and writing descriptions of these, letters from soldiers back home, or, medallions and things, and learning all these terms like, models. Then I applied to film school with the idea of, studying screenwriting and directing. And the week I got into Columbia Film School and was turned down by NYU, that week I also was offered a job at the New Yorker, working in the special events department that put on the New Yorker Festival. So, and I had this background that appealed to the director of the festival, Rhonda Sherman, which was that I was an English major, but I also knew how to put on a show. And the whole thing about the New Yorker Festival is that it's translating the New Yorker into a kind of live version on stage. And so I decided, I could go to film school, but I feel like this scares me more in a way. I had never worked in an office. I liked the New Yorker and didn't know how it worked. And the idea of sort of being there just kind of terrified me, but I thought I should learn how to do this. I'll just do this for a year, and then I'll apply to film school again, because you couldn't defer. So I took the job with the New Yorker Festival and worked there for a year, applied to Columbia again. I got in again, and the same week I got in again, the woman who edited the theater listings for Goings On About Town started sending me on assignments to review plays. And these were unsigned capsule reviews of, 80 words. But I still thought, I should see where this is going. I'm now getting this little opportunity to write for the magazine. And back then there was no website really. So that was there were very few avenues into writing if you were a young person who worked in the office. So at that point, I turned down Columbia Film School again and thought to myself, okay, I'm clearly not going to film school. I've made this decision now 2 years in a row. They are very nice to let me in, but I must seem like a complete crazy person to them. And I think I should stick with this New Yorker thing for a bit more. And so I wound up working on the New Yorker Festival staff for 9 years.
Oh, wow.
And that was really my sort of my day job there. But during that time, I branched out. I really wanted to write for the Talk of the Town section, which I just love. I still write for quite a lot. So, and to me, I had never studied journalism. I had never done any journalism. But Talk of the Town seemed to me much more in keeping with these writers that I had loved, who were kind of absurdist playwrights like Christopher Durang and John Guare and Tom Stopper, these kind of very cerebral but silly writers of plays. And, Talk of the Town pieces are basically like one-act plays. They have a beginning, middle, and end. They take place sort of in real time. They're very dialogue heavy, and they're all about sort of observing the joyful ironies of life. So I just felt like I got them and I could do them. And again, this was a point where the magazine didn't have original web content. So that was pretty much the only game in town to get started writing if you worked there, is to write for the Talk of the Town section. Aside from the, anonymous theater reviews that I was writing. I did a bunch of trial and error where I pitched pieces and wrote them and they weren't quite right. But the editor, Susan Morrison, was so encouraging and just kept saying, try again, I'm sure you'll be able to write them. And kept telling me, like, if I had an idea, she'd say, oh yeah, go try it. Finally, so this is the summer of 2006, I was living near the South Street Seaport in downtown New York. And one day I went out and I saw this guy at a sort of exhibit outside the seaport under a tent, and he was a cooper from Colonial Williamsburg. And coopers are people who make barrels and tubs and things. Mm-hmm. Anything that involves wooden staves bound by loops of metal. I just grabbed him. This was a Saturday, and I said, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And he said, "I don't know. I'm gonna walk around the city with my wife." And I said, "Can I come with you? Can I write a story about you?" And he said, "Sure." And that's when I thought, well, we should go, since you're from Colonial Williamsburg, we should go to Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which back then was not really the gentrified place it was now. It was really like a hipster hotbed. It was a hotbed. It was really like a crunchy place for like college kids, which is on its way to gentrification, but not big glassy towers. So I took him and his wife to Williamsburg, and I thought he was going to just remark about how trendy everything was, but instead he would just point at all the barrels that he saw, like in the back of bars, and critique them. And, the water towers on top of buildings, which are also, and he'd be like, "Oh, that's cooperage." So it was just absurd. And I didn't even pitch the story. I just did it and wrote it and turned it in. And that was my first Talk of the Town piece. And so then I started writing them more regularly, and, eventually was able to do longer profiles, and I started freelancing to build up my experience. So, this is the long answer to the question: how did you get? Who encouraged you to write, or how did you get into it? It was really just like a series of, a series of accidents. And I still haven't, ever taken a class in journalism or anything like that.
Yeah, and well, in a sense, you might not have had like the formal class in journalism, but working on the New Yorker festival staff for 9 years and being immersed in the culture, and of course, most likely, well, you like the Talk of the Town piece, so you're reading those, you're reading the magazine. Really, in some ways, there's no better education than to go out and just read the stuff you want to be writing. And so that it seems like, yeah, it maybe not a formal education, but in a sense, you were kind of auditing a master class.
Yeah, and also you learn by being edited. I really needed some heavy editing at the beginning, and was so grateful that, this editor Susan took the time to, get my pieces in shape so that I could learn. And I would sit and study. Okay, why did she make this change? Why did she write this sentence this way? And for that section, Talk of the Town, it's so much about rhythm and tone, and humor, and it's extremely specific. So I would spend a long time trying to think about, after a piece came out, I'd think, okay, how did it wind up this way? Why is this the way? And that's how I learned how to do it. But it's still a bit scary to, learn how to write journalism while writing for the New Yorker. So I sometimes do wish I had taken a class or something.
Yeah.
Learning how to interview also was another skill that, it's difficult. Took me a while to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, how did you cultivate that skill of not only just interviewing to get information, but interviewing to develop narrative and develop story?
And for Talk of the Town pieces, they're also really, they're a lot about observation too. You don't want to just have an interview. You want to have someone out in the world, interacting with other people, doing things, interacting with a location. They're really not kind of sit-down interviews. I'm trying to think of some examples. I mean, even for celebrity interviews that I do for that section, I try to get them out into the world to do something. Like just one example that I loved doing was when Emma Thompson came out with her movie Saving Mr. Banks about P.L. Travers, who wrote the Mary Poppins book. I thought, okay, how do we do something that's Mary Poppins-esque? And I cajoled her into going to fly a kite in Central Park. So I went and flew a kite with Emma Thompson, and the piece was about her flying a kite, and then sort of in the middle of the kite flying, she would talk to me about P.L. Travers, and I'd ask her about her experience with nannies, and I feel like it's a great format because people, especially who are promoting a movie or a project or a play, they go a little bit on autopilot in terms of their spiel. Just getting them out into the world is a great way to get something fresher and more original, and also to describe something a bit funny and absurd. Yeah, and in terms of just learning how to interview, it's obviously 70% an organic skill, just the ability to talk with people, the ability to sort of read people quickly and then put them at ease and figure out what they respond to. But then you learn to, I guess, anticipate things that you'll need later. If someone's telling a story and they didn't say, where the story took place, what year it was, I know now to stop and say, okay, explain this a little bit more clearly. And then also, when people get sort of off track onto something that you just know is not going to be super helpful, how to politely steer them back. It's not brain surgery interviewing, but it's not easy either.
Yeah, exactly. It takes for a lot of people, they don't realize that it is kind of like a skill you kind of learn, and then it also, it's on you to have, say, the courage to stop and slow them down, be like, oh no, this is great, like I'm trying to, can you dig deep on this, because this is something they've been stewing on for years, and here you are hearing it for the first time. You're like, oh no, let's slow down, let's expand on this, let's go back, what year, put us in context, and slow them down in that nature. And it's definitely something you learn and cultivate over time, which it appears that you've done quite well, being able to write these long features and these talk of the town pieces.
And also sort of trusting yourself to not be too scripted in what you're asking, allowing for there to be spontaneity, but also getting what you need,
Yeah. There's a great interviewer I know who his name's Joe Donahue. He's my favorite interviewer. He hosts a couple shows for WAMC Public Radio in in Albany, New York, so about 2 hours north of you, and he just kind of calls it like a call and response thing. He does his research, but he's also he's a great listener, and he's very open to, wherever the conversation stirs it. And he just has a great way of navigating that and not just reading off a list of questions, which, is irritating to a listener, if you ask me.
Yeah. And different forms of interview also require different kinds of things. I mean, I've now started doing more interviews for the New Yorker Radio Hour, and as audio interviews are a completely different skill. Something that people are going, or being in the New Yorker Festival, I've now interviewed people live on stage a number of times, and you need to approach it completely differently than something that's going to be written up and more descriptive and observational. They're all slightly different skills.
Yeah, the live interview, that must be tricky, because there is an essentially, well, maybe not for you, because there's a performative element to it, and that kind of tethers back to your experience as an actor, at least in studying the theater. Was that a kind of a natural transition for you to be able to be comfortable in that chair up on a stage speaking to somebody?
Yeah, I don't get nervous about being on stage at all. I'm pretty comfortable with it, and I like it. I'm fine with that. It's tricky in other ways. If you're interviewing someone on stage, you really have to let them shine, and some people just have different wavelengths than others. I mean, I did one with Nathan Lane, and he was very he was sort of tight-lipped backstage, and I thought, oh my gosh, is Nathan Lane actually not fun? And then we got on stage, he's in front of 600 people, and he just lit up like that, and did a show. I asked about 5 questions in an hour and 15 minutes, and then it was over. It was so easy, but but then other people are a little more challenging.
When you were starting to gain some momentum with these Talk of the Town pieces, and even the first one with the Cooper, and you were starting to see how you were being edited, what was that experience like, turning in something that you thought was like, all right, this feels fully formed, and then you get it back, and it's like, holy shit, I have a lot of learning to do here?
I never thought it was fully formed. I mean, I'm happy to be edited, and the editing is so great, and what was exciting about it was that I loved Talk of the Town. I read it religiously, just hoping to be sort of just soak it in and do it. So seeing a sentence get a little bit more Talk of the Towny, a little bit funnier, a little bit sharper, it was great. I was so happy about it, and it wasn't always what I expected. A lot of the time, it was just about simplifying things, clarifying things. It was never about making anything sound fancier. if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It was much more about subtracting than adding or clarifying, really. And sometimes she'd ask me for a little more detail about something, or even a little more reporting, which is great.
And as you started doing longer and longer features, how did you start to develop sort of that the pacing and the endurance to to carry a story to 5 and 8 and 10,000 words after developing some of those finer muscles in Talk of the Town? Like, how did you start to develop that endurance to carry a narrative over the course of several thousand words?
Yeah, it's that was that was a steeper learning curve, I think.
Mm-hmm.
When I first started writing things that were 5,000 word New Yorker profiles, because you do have to think much more about structure. I hadn't done it before, and I had the same editor who was great and very patient. But it's learning things like the quote unquote bio section where you say so and so was born in 1980 in Birmingham. Knowing how one of the earliest things that she encouraged me to do was just delay that. You have to care about the person first before you start find out about their childhood. Things like that weren't obvious to me. And they're just complex puzzles, and that those were cases where, again, I'd have to at times go out and report a little more because it didn't have quite the there was some element missing. The idea of mixing scenes with interview, seeing people, you open on a on a scene or shift to something where someone is in a shopping for scarves or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The New Yorker profile has this certain rhythm and this certain structure. I'll tell you something. The first one I was signed never ran. So my first attempt at this completely failed. And it was a combination of reasons. One is that I had no idea how to write them and was just making it up as I went along and turning in drafts that were not quite right. And so I had to go back, report a little more, redo them, and send in a completely new draft. And then at the same time, so the subject of this profile was a Broadway composer who had just had a big hit. And I think the editors thought, okay, well, he's writing, 3 more musicals. So one of them will be on Broadway in the next year. And that'll be the time to run this piece. And in the meanwhile, I was trying, failing to, get it in shape. And, musicals take years and years to develop. And this guy kind of stalled in what he was in where his shows were going. The piece was just stuck. It was just stuck. My writing was not good enough. He didn't have a show kind of landing on Broadway right away as the sort of sophomore effort to this big show that had been a huge success. So it just got stuck, and I was so discouraged. And finally, I went back to the editor and said, "Can I please just put this aside and try something else?" And thankfully, she gave me a new subject who was a playwright who had a play going to Broadway like in 3 months, and that was my first profile that got published. And it's one I'm still very happy with. So I think it did take me this this belly flop to figure out how to do it and to get a subject who kind of clicked.
How did you find the confidence to bounce back from that discouragement of banging your head against the wall of that first profile to then sink back into the pocket of this second one, which was a great rebound effort for you?
I mean, I don't know. Like I was really I was really stressed about it, and this went on for like 2 years maybe, where I was just kind of working on this one piece. I remember seeing a friend of mine from college around that time when I was really just sort of just torturing myself over it. And he was a friend from out of town, and I saw him, maybe once every year or two. And he said, "Listen, if I see you next time and you're still working on this piece, I'm going to be furious at you. You need to you can't live your life inside of this thing that's going nowhere." And that was really helpful. I was like, yeah, he's right. I can't, this can't be forever. I can't let my entire small budding writing career just stall out because of this one story. You have to keep moving. And, I won't lie and say it was, that I was just confident and happy the whole time that something would work out. And in fact, when I realized that the story was not going to run, no one ever really told me it wasn't going to run. It just didn't. And then I finally was like, please give me something else to work on. That didn't necessarily have to happen. I might have just, it might have just ended right there. But I do think it's important to just keep moving as a writer and not get stuck in something that takes over your life and makes you miserable. I don't know. I needed to keep moving and found a way to do that.
Yeah, and with respect to keeping moving as a staff writer for New Yorker, but also freelancing pieces here and there, how do you keep that flywheel in motion, and how do you generate your ideas and go down maybe multiple rabbit holes so you can, as you say, keep moving?
Well, I'm always working on a bunch of things at once, and they're a combination of short things, medium things, and long things. To go back to theater for a second, the late, great director, producer, Hal Prince, always said that whenever he had a show open, his first meeting for his next show was scheduled for the next day. There's something about keeping moving. I just always have a list of things that I'm pursuing or in the middle of working on. So it never feels like anything just grinds to a halt.
Yeah. So that's, Austin Kleon has a great term for that, and he calls it like creative chain smoking. It's like whenever you finish one project, you use the ember of that dying cigarette to light the next project. That way you never do stall.
Right, yeah. And I get pretty miserable the few times when I don't have something exciting that I'm working on, I'm kind of in this for the fun, I should say. As you've probably picked up, I never, I'm not the kind of person who went to journalism school or worshipped newspaper reporting or hard news. I just kind of thought, I was like a theater kid who fell into this very specific type of journalism that is kind of like nonfiction humor, and it makes me really happy to do. So, I kind of pursue fun and try to make try to put out writing that is sort of driven by by like an element of joy.
Are there other things you're doing on the side that help sort of subsidize and supplement the writing you're doing, or is the freelancing you're doing like the main gig that is, sustaining you?
Well, I'm not a freelancer anymore because I'm now a staff writer. So I really got one gig. But,
Okay.
Over the years, it's been a few different situations. After 9 years in the New Yorker Festival department, I had sort of worked my way up this tiny little department to a point where I was booking the festival, and it's 50 events in 3 days, so that's a really stressful job, and It's dealing with 1,000 different elements, and it was a really great job, but I felt at a certain point like, okay, this is actually really tough, and I feel a bit chained to my desk. And I realized that I wasn't moving as quickly as I wanted to within the New Yorker while working in this department. So that's the point where I started thinking about wanting to write a book. And when I got this book deal, I quit my job, and I went from being at the office 5 days a week to working at home 5 days a week, and just waking up every morning and thinking about this one thing. So that was really different.
And this is your Meryl Streep book, right?
Yeah. So I would just wake up every day and it would be another day of thinking and writing and researching all about Meryl Streep. So that was a pretty intense way to live. And I didn't do a ton for the New Yorker during that time. I kept my connection with it, but I didn't have coworkers. I was just on my own. And then as I was finishing that, the magazine just happened to have a part-time editing job. And I wasn't ready to give up my, writerly life at home, but I also missed having coworkers, and it was the perfect situation for me. And that job, which was actually taking over the editing of the theater section of Goings On About Town, which I had written for many years at that point. That was just a great way to get back into the magazine, and that's what led me to being a full-time writer for them. Mm. So I've now had situations where I was full-time at an office, 0 time at an office, and half and half. And for me, I think half and half is a really good way to do it, because I'm a very social creature and I don't like being on my own all the time. I kind of crave coworkers, although not right now because I don't want to get coronavirus, so I'm not going anywhere. But I also don't want to be in a sort of office environment every single day. Right now I have this freedom to go in when I want to, or when I'm closing a piece and have to have meetings and stuff like that. And I usually go, 1 or 2 days a week into the New Yorker. But I don't know. I also like working at home. Mm-hmm. So I get a little bit of both. And I'm never completely desperate for people, for socializing.
Yeah. And I like this idea of, too, like when you're trying to bring a piece home, like that's when you kind of go into the office for maybe those 2 days and try to stick the landing. So what's that experience like when you've got this thing, it's just about there, but, you're at 10,000 feet and you're coming down to JFK. So like what does that look like as you're maybe going back and forth with your editor?
Well, at that point, a lot of people are involved. That we have a very thorough fact-checking process. So, and the fact-checkers are totally great. They're so brilliant. So you have a fact-checker who's, you've been working with for, a week or two. You have the subject who usually, on schedule. The subject always freaks out when they're being fact-checked because they suddenly hear this grocery list of things that they, what they said and what they wore on whatever day 2 months ago, and they're suddenly think, wait, what is this? What's in this story? And one of the benefits of fact checking is that the freak out is then, and you can deal with it, and not, the moment it appears in print or online. So you're dealing with a fact checker, you're dealing with the subject, and if it's a celebrity, it's a publicist who is having all these, last minute concerns, with your editor, of course, with a copy editor, and there are multiple levels of editing as well. There's our editor in chief, David Remnick, who reads things and sometimes weighs in with his own notes. So it's just, there's a lot of people involved, and I love that aspect of it. And we usually end with a closing meeting with the editor, the fact checker, the copy editor, and the writer, and we go page by page. And if anyone has any last, changes or questions or whatever, we can all do it then. We all go around one by one and like fine tune these very last things. I love that. I always have a good time doing it.
Yeah, it sounds really, really cool. Like, well, you're a social critter yourself, but also that it does have this element of collaboration, which is really, I don't know, I think kind of nourishing in a way to get all those kind of voices, because ultimately it serves the piece in the end to have all these voices who really want this thing to sing.
Yeah, and working on a long piece, it's just a big puzzle, and one sentence up top will affect some other sentence on the last page, and like we just had one where it was like, oh, we changed this one line, and that means that we don't mention anywhere that the subject has 3 children. Do we need to put that somewhere? We lost that fact. Where do we put that? That has to go before this other thing. It's just a big project that with a lot of moving pieces, and that's fun to work on.
And I imagine that the James Corden profile that you did a few weeks ago, that published a few weeks ago at this point, that must have been a great intersection of a lot of your passions and everything, given that, it was a brilliant celebrity profile for one, and nobody does celebrity profiles better than a New Yorker, in my opinion. But also the fact that he's a performer and came from theater and all this, and he's a singer and all this. It must have really just overlapped a lot of, interests for you as the reporter to do this piece.
It did, yeah. I mean, I love writing about performers. I love writing about actors. He's a kind of born and bred performer. that was a challenging piece actually,
Mm-hmm.
in part because a lot of people don't like James Corden, and I knew that going in. I knew that he just kind of bugs people, certain people, not everyone. Some people I know like just were thrilled and they loved him. They're like, oh my gosh, he's such a talent. For me, I had a lovely time with him, and I went to the set of the Late Late Show for a week, and everyone was really nice. But I was also aware that they were, in some sense, putting on a show for me. And the tricky thing was that I wanted to invite in people who were reading who don't like James Corden or had their doubts about James Corden, and say, okay, I see you. This is not a puff piece. This is not a takedown either. But we're going to talk about what it is about him that people either love or don't love. And that I just found very tricky.
Yeah, that must have been. Did you come in knowing that that was the approach you wanted to take to the piece, and then realize like this is going to be kind of a tough nut to crack? But in order to tell this story the best possible way, I'm going to have to address the sort of nuance around him and who he represents.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's always with a celebrity profile, you're always writing about kind of two things at once. One is who the person is at their core and why they are that way, and the other is who they are in the culture and their importance. To give another example, a few months ago I wrote a profile of Adam Driver, who, and that in a way it was a much easier profile to write because he's, first of all, he's just so eccentric, and he's just like this big ball of anxiety, and the stuff that's interesting about him just comes out of every pore. He's just an interesting person to write about, and I knew it would be a fun story to work on. But I was also writing about why is it that this guy is suddenly in everything, and why is it that all these great directors love to work with him. So I didn't want it to just be like Adam Driver is a kooky dude. It was also, is Adam Driver an important actor of his generation, and why? People who live very public lives, you kind of have to write about their public personae, I guess. That to me is something really fascinating. How people interact, as with the world. How they deal with fame. I think fame is it's like this catalyst that just it almost to switch metaphors. It almost magnifies certain elements of people's personalities, and it's a real challenge for some people to see how people's personalities and paths intersect with them becoming famous. With James Corden, that was also a big topic because he became famous in England as a 20-something, and went through a period where he acted like a huge jerk, and admits that he was being a huge jerk, and basically everyone in England just turned against him, and he had to almost restart his career in America. So I found that arc so interesting, and a lot of people who know him here in the States still, this was all news to them, that he had this kind of tabloid life in England 10 years ago, and that was a real revelation for a lot of people who read the profile, who didn't know where he had come from, why this British guy was suddenly on their TV screens 5 nights a week.
Yeah, that's and getting to the the reporting of the piece itself. I think there's only one instance, and because I just put a box around it, where you essentially said that he told you something. Like I don't think you lean on that device very often, and like when you do that in a piece, are you just trying to signify to the reader signal to the reader that was like, hey, this is reporting that I got firsthand from him, and not like something that I was able to like say pluck from, I don't know, a Vanity Fair interview or something?
No, I mean it's all things. I rarely quote previous profiles. It's all things that I observe and experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe what you're asking is like, the moment where I kind of put myself in it a tiny bit. I think I do that at the end when he's packing in his house and he talks to me about cats. I mean, I sometimes like to have a moment where I don't really put myself in it as like a subject, but I I want people to imagine me having a conversation with him, just because it's a weird moment that opens up a little side door to something or is revealing in some way, and isn't necessarily just a sort of disembodied quote, or even him going about his business at the Late Late Show or whatever. I had that in the Adam Driver profile too. There was a moment where we were talking about Fight Club, and I said something about toxic masculinity, and he had no idea what I was talking about. He's like, toxic masculinity? What? I haven't heard much about that. And then he thought about that, and then I saw him later that very day, and he brought it up again, and he was almost frustrated at that point, because he felt like he's this kid who he grew up in Indiana in a very conservative religious environment, and he still feels like he just hasn't learned sort of some sophisticated stuff that people talk about, in this milieu that he's in now of, kind of Brooklyn-y pop culture. So I just thought that was really revealing and interesting. And so I kind of wove myself into that part a tiny bit.
Yeah, I'm always that choice that a reporter makes always fascinates me. Like, I'm always kind of keeping my ears attuned to, like, all right, when and if are they gonna kind of fold into the story, and why are they doing it? It's always I always love unpacking that a bit. So that's kind of cool to see your process behind that as a strategy for telling the story. Towards the end of the Corden piece, I love this part that you were able to cite. It was like from Gary Shandling's diaries or something, to the effect that Corden was reading it, and it's something that that Shandling had written. It says, like, don't identify yourself with your career. You are you. You are not your job. Also, this summer, work on your stand-up. And that was a note Shandling was writing to himself, and that's right at the end of the piece. And I kind of extend so that you're coming down to the hammer, so that there's definitely meaning there. And I'd extend that to you. Like, how do you sort of maybe get back to doing quote unquote stand up and not identify yourself too much with the craft that you're doing? What is that? How does that manifest for you, maybe?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I will say, first of all, that the second that happened, I knew that was going to be the end of the profile. Like, the moment I heard him talk about that Gary Shandling quote and say, maybe it's not so healthy to have a standing ovation every day, I was like, that's it. There's my ending. I mean, that's perfect. So no matter, there's a whole part after that where I went to London with him and met his parents and everything, but I thought, okay, no, I'm going to work my way back to that. And so it was a huge relief to have an ending. You kind of know when you hear it, and I knew it right then. I was like, that's the last line. But for me, being a writer, you have to just remain interested in things and not cut yourself off from experience. For me, I think it's more of a challenge to there's so much talk now about being a brand, especially on social media. What's your brand? And to me, the challenge is more, how do I just shake myself loose of that a little bit and not worry so much about what's my brand? Like, is this something that people would expect me to do? Sometimes I like it, if I do something and someone's like, oh, that's such a Michael thing, like a story, or I like to keep myself on my toes a little bit and not be too on brand. Even right now, I'm sort of feeling like I want to do something that's not just a profile of a performer, although that's what I'm actively working on right now. Is another one of those, keeping myself on my toes and not worrying about too much about sort of what people expect or what my kind of circle of interest is perceived to be. I think it's helpful on some level to know that, but it's also it also boxes you in.
Have you, and pardon me if you've done this and I just didn't find it in my research, it's kind of performer adjacent. Like, have you done profiles on professional athletes who are, who do have some sort of some degree of demonstrability about them?
I'm telling you, I'm the last person you want to write about anything athletic. I can't do sports. I don't know sports. It's like, no. that would be a disaster. I'd be like, what's a touchdown? No. And
just one more thing, Michael. When you were, when you found that ending for the Corden piece, when you stumbled upon it in your reporting, at what point in your reporting, over the course of the timeline of your reporting, did that ending strike you?
The moment it happened, the moment I heard him say that line, I don't think it's healthy to have a standing ovation every day. The moment I heard it, I was like, that's the end. But I should mention, like, before that happened, one way I focus profiles, I have been doing this lately a bit, is that I give myself a secret word that is kind of the theme of the piece, and that helps me just focus. For James Corden, for instance, it was joy, because I felt like the way he sees himself is he's someone who tries to create happiness and joy for an audience, and whether or not he does that, or whether or not he himself is happy, kind of became a through line of the piece. For instance, but okay, so some other examples. I wrote a piece about Bo Burnham, and the secret word for me was anxiety. For someone else, it was coming of age. For someone else, it was insecurity. So that really helps me make a profile that's not just a collection of anecdotes and facts, but something that coheres. And the nice thing about that is that a lot of the time, I don't use this word in the piece more than once, but I've noticed more times than not, when it comes time to write a headline and a subhead, the editor will use that word without my saying anything. Like, I think with James Corden, the subhead of the piece online was, James Corden sees his job as, to create joy. Or with Bo Burnham, the web headline was Bo Burnham's Age of Anxiety. So I always find that a bit validating when my kind of secret theme word is picked out as the headline, because I'm like, oh, I succeeded. Like, this actually does cohere around that idea. Yeah. So for that moment where Corden was reading the Gary Shandling book and, wondering, is this job my key to happiness? That's why it worked, because it was him questioning his own happiness while doing this job that's all about creating happiness for others. And so it just hit me like that this sort of speaks directly to that question and that theme.
Very nice. Well, Michael, this was awesome getting to kind of unpack how you go about these profiles and about the work and how you got to where you are with the New Yorker. Reading these profiles that you do are always just to piggyback on the theme of your Corden piece, just a joy they are a joy to read. And so anytime I see your byline, I'm like, all right, cool. Like, I'm gonna strap in here for an hour and have a damn good time reading this piece. So for people who want to get more familiar with your work, if they're somehow not already familiar with it, where can they find you online?
Well, my work's at the New Yorker. I have a website, michael-schulman.com, where I post stuff. I don't know. I'm on Twitter, MJ Schulman. So I usually post up there. Yeah. And let me plug my book. My book is called Her Again, Becoming Meryl Streep. So I have a lot of writing in that.
Fantastic. Yeah, I can't wait to dig into that. Maybe sometime down the road we can unpack the book, or even whatever next book you have coming down the line. That'd be wonderful. And there's also this great essay, great piece you wrote in Believer about Groundhog Day and the writer for Groundhog Day that we didn't get to talk about, which is awesome too.
Oh, thank you.
You got it, Michael. Well, thanks again for the time, and enjoy the rest of your day and stay healthy.
All right, you too. Good to talk to you.
We did it. We made it, CNFers. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure you're subscribing to the show, of course. This crazy show is produced by me, Brendan O'Mara. Hey. I make the show for you. I hope it made something worth sharing. And if you really dig the show, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes are at BrendanO'Mara.com. Follow the show on the various social media channels at CNFPod across them all. Get that newsletter at my website. Win books, win zines, hang out with your buddy B.O. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Are we done here? We must. Because if you can't do interviews, see ya!